episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and while Coach Weasel will be hosting this episode, I wanted to poke in real quick and let you know about the GTO Poker Ranges app if you haven't already downloaded it. Our goal with this app is to put your entire preflop strategy right in your pocket, so you know what to open raise, what to 3-bet, what to 4-bet, and everything in between. This is great whether you've been playing for a while and you're really just double checking whether or not your preflop strategy is right on track, or if you're a little bit newer to poker and you're like, I'm not 100% sure what I should be playing preflop, this is what you want to get. We essentially took all of our ranges that we've been creating over the years in programs like Core and Pro, also added some new solves, and we have many more coming in the future. To learn more about this app, visit redchippoker.com/app, or you can always search for the GTO Poker Ranges app on your app store. And by the way, the open raising ranges are 100% free, so make sure to download it and check those out. This even includes the GTO open raising ranges, which you won't really find in many other places, especially not for free. Again, this is the GTO Poker Ranges app by Red Chip Poker. With all that said, I'm going to kick it over to Coach Weasel, who's going to talk a little bit more in depth about the ranges in this app. Let's get started.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about using solved preflop ranges. A lot of us are thinking about the new Red Chip Poker app, and inside that app is a complete set of solved preflop ranges. The obvious question is, how can we make the best use of solved preflop ranges? Should we be using solved preflop ranges even, or should we be using some type of exploitative set of preflop ranges? Well, let's find out in this episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. Solved ranges. What are the advantages of solved ranges? Firstly, they're great for a baseline strategy. It tells us what we should be doing in theory in every preflop scenario. It doesn't mean that we have to play this way, but whether we play this way or not, this is still very valuable information. One of the really attractive features about learning a set of preflop solved ranges is that the information doesn't expire. If you're learning to play from a set of exploitative ranges, we might find that we have to adjust our preflop strategies as those exploitative ranges adjust. Maybe we've got them from a specific source. The creator of those ranges decides, okay, we should be cold calling a bit wider in this spot. We should be 3-betting wider here. The ranges get changed. We've invested all of this time learning an exploitative set of preflop ranges, and now we're told we have to use a different strategy. The really cool thing about solved ranges is that this information is going to be valid for an indefinite period of time. If we keep all variables the same, for example, it's a 6 max cash game, 100 big blind effective stack, the theoretical solution to that game doesn't change. So if we learn a really solid set of solved preflop ranges now, that information is still going to be valid 10 or even 20 years from now. That's not to say it's the best way to play in every situation. So it's a good starting point to learn our solved ranges, but deviations should likely be made. Now, not in every spot. We'll find that solved ranges are more applicable in some scenarios, but less applicable in other scenarios. The goal here is to understand where solved ranges are most applicable and where we're most likely to have to make deviations to the solved set of preflop ranges. Let's think about some examples. So if you have the raise first in solved ranges in the Red Chip Poker app, and you have a look at the button recommended RFI range, we'll see that the recommended frequency is 41.5%. Now, if we take a look at a different set of solved ranges and check out the RFI range on the button, we'll usually get a value that's a little bit higher than this, perhaps something like 43.5 instead of 41.5. Now, it does depend on the setup of the solve. Obviously, it depends on the post-flop game tree, it depends on the pre-flop game tree. But one of the simplifications that's made with the Red Chip Poker solved ranges is that mixed strategies are ignored. So a simple example, another set of solved ranges here, we have the combo Jack 3 suited mixed into the RFI range with about 31.5% frequency, which means that it's open folded on the button 68.5% at the time. Now, this is a very minute detail. It's not going to be that helpful. What it's really saying is that most of the time, Jack 3 suited should be open folded on the button. So with the Red Chip Poker solved ranges, rather than having Jack 3 suited mixed 31.5% of the time into the open raising range, It's simply not included on the range. So we can see there's a simplification towards pushing hands into pure strategies, and it's designed just to make the ranges a bit easier to use. But there's an important lesson here for us, and that's that the edges of any preflop range, whether it's RFI range or it's some other situation, the edges of that range are likely not super important. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First reason is simply that these hands may or may not be in the range anyway, if we have a slightly different game tree. And secondly, these hands around the edge of the range are usually fairly close to 0 EV anyway. The very fact that some solvers mix it into the folding range with some frequency means that the EV of raising also has to be exactly 0. So rather than focus on these very small details which are not going to influence our win rate, the goal should be to get a very general picture of what we should be playing pre-flop, but then make exploitative adjustments. Now the reason why we're thinking about RFI on the button is because it's a situation where potentially very large adjustments could be incentivized. And it all depends on the players we have in the blinds. The solver, when it opens 41.5% of hands, it's assuming that the opponents in the blinds are perfect GTO opponents. Whereas in reality, we might have players who are falling too much in the blinds. We might have players who are maybe calling a bit too much, but then proceeding to play very badly post-flop. All of these are reasons why we should be able to expand our button RFI beyond the RFI frequency recommended by the solver. And the adjustment can be quite extreme in a button RFI situation. There are plenty of situations where we should be open raising any 2 cards on the button. So if we were to dogmatically stick to playing 41.5% of holdings in that spot, we'd be missing out on a lot of exploitative EV. On the other hand, if we look in the blinds and we see 2 very good opponents, we're not really sure how to exploit them, they're playing a very solid game plan, well now that 41.5% starting point is likely a very good default starting point. Now another situation where I want to be very careful about playing solver ranges is when the action starts becoming very large pre-flop. So what we often find is that strategies for small situations are usually very good. RFI ranges are usually good, aside from the exploitative adjustments we've mentioned for the button. Things like cold calling range is very good. 3-bet ranges are very good by default. Defend versus 3-bet ranges. We can pretty much use these as is in the vast majority of games as a default strategy. Now the situation where the solved ranges might not be so good by default is, let's say for example, when we're facing a 4-bet or when we're facing a 5-bet, for example. We're facing a 3-bet and deciding what our 4-betting range should look like. Now, as an example of this, let's think about the solved red chip range for defending against a 4-bet, big blind versus button. So the action here is button has open raised, we've 3-bet from the big blind, and now we're facing a 4-bet from the button. Now the solver is going to be assuming that button is 4-betting some fairly speculative hands, and as a result, we see holdings like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, ace 5 suited, and king jack suited in the flatting range, out of position against a 4-bet. So these are theoretically correct, but the problem we run into in many games is that the 4-bet range of the button is not actually as wide as a solver would be assuming. In fact, it's going to be significantly tighter. So we end up in a situation where these more speculative flat versus 4-bet holdings are actually going to be directly losing as a result. If we consider the 5-bet range for the big blind to jam against the button 4-bet, we have holdings like pocket 8s, which was also in the flatting range, ace 3 suited, ace 4 suited, and king queen suited, being the edge of the 5-bet jamming range. Again, these holdings might be okay in theory, but against many players, it's actually going to be directly losing. Now, if we just take a look at the 4-bet range that the solver is anticipating, well, the 4-better should show up with holdings like ace-2 suited, ace-6 suited, ace-10 and ace-jack offsuit. The other interesting detail here, which is likely omitted from the red chip solved ranges for simplification purposes, is that a correct 4-betting strategy also has holdings like queen 9 suited, jack 9 suited, 10-8 suited, king 5 suited, pocket 5s, king 10 offsuit. All of these hands are in the 4-bet range with a very low frequency. We just don't see them in the red chip recommended 4-bet range here because they've been removed for simplification reasons. However, those hands will have been factored into the solve that was run to produce the red chip poker ranges. So you can see there's an assumption here that many hands are being 4-bet on the button, which are actually maybe not being 4-bet in practice. If that's the case, it means the 4-bet range is stronger, and it means that as a defender, we can't flat as wide as the solver is recommending against 4-bets, and we can't jam as wide. The solver would usually anticipate in this scenario that if big blind did 5-bet jam, the button would be folding around 44.5% of the time to a 5-bet. And that's going to be a big part of what allows big blind to 5-bet profitably with holdings like pocket 8s and ace-3 suited. If we take a look at a data report from many player pools, we find that typically the fold to 5-bet stat in this scenario is more like 35%, 10% lower than the solver is anticipating. So we can see here it's not necessarily going to be practical to jam the same range as the solver is recommending. Once again, it's still useful information. It's still great to know what a theoretical jamming range might look like, and we can use that range against the right types of opponents, but it might not be the best strategy by default. Let's think a little bit about big blind 3-betting strategies and how we might want to use that information and deviate from it in practice. So big blind 3-bet is always a little bit of a unique table position. And that's because we observe pretty significant polarization effects when 3-betting from the big blind. Now, I don't like the term polarized here because I don't really believe that it's the right terminology to describe big blind 3-betting strategies. So I've made up a term. I refer to it as pseudo-polarization. And the reason why I do that is because we absolutely don't 3-bet the worst holdings in our defending range. The worst holdings in our defending range from the big blind when facing an open are actually going to be cold-called. So although there is quite a considerable gap between the weakest hands we 3-bet and the strongest hands we 3-bet, and there's some hands in the middle that actually flat, the weakest hands in our defending range are all cold calls. So that's why I prefer the term pseudo-polarization. But we definitely observe a gap where we have a chunk of value hands, and then we have some hands that we might refer to as bluffs or semi-bluffs. Quick example, in the red chip ranges, we have 8s plus, ace-10 suited plus, and ace-stack offsuit plus in the 3-bet strategy. But we also have holdings like queen-7 and king-6 suited in the 3-bet range, despite the fact that queen-8 through queen-jack suited are all flat calls, and king-7 through king-10 suited are all flat calls. So you can see some of the 3-bets are weaker than the calling range. Now, the interesting thing with this pseudo-polarization is that it's related to the sizing of the 3-bet. And these pseudo-polarization effects only occur when the 3-bet sizing is sufficiently large. If we were to force the solver to use a 3-bet sizing which is a little bit smaller than optimal, then suddenly we start seeing these pseudo-polarized ranges start to become extremely depolarized. Now, depolarized ranges are a lot easier to play for the average person. So seeing as we're not solvers, we might actually find it easier to play depolarized 3-bet strategies with a smaller 3-bet sizing, rather than pseudo-polarized 3-bet strategies from the big blind with a very large 3-bet sizing. So of course we know that the solver's right in theory, but it still leaves us the question, which is better in practice? Something that's technically correct but very difficult to execute, or something that's technically incorrect but is probably going to generate a higher win rate for the average player and is going to be easier to play post-flop? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here, but we can certainly see why we might choose to deviate from solver strategy in this scenario. Now let's think about big blind cold calling ranges. One of the things that solvers have taught us is that big blind defending ranges are very wide. We cold call a lot. And some of the hands we call as part of that very wide big blind cold calling range are going to be very close to 0 EV. In fact, we'll see that some of them, and again, we won't see this on the red chip poker ranges because this complexity has been removed to some extent, but there are going to be some hands which are so weak that although they're sometimes cold called, they're mixed into the folding range with some frequency. In other words, there's absolutely 0 win rate benefit for playing these hands, The only reason that they should be played is for balance considerations. Simple example here, with the red chip poker solved range, big blind versus button open, we have 10-5 and 10-4 as pure folds. Whereas according to a full solve, where we have the mixes included, we have holdings like 10-4 suited should be calling 30% at the time and folding 70%, whereas 10-5 suited should actually be defending 65% at the time and folding 35% at the time. Now the EV of these hands as a defend is 0, according to the solver. So the only benefit of defending these hands is to make sure our game plan is balanced. But realistically, is our opponent ever going to figure out that we're not defending 10-5 suited with a high enough frequency and be able to generate a counter exploit against that? It's extremely unlikely. The other thing to consider here is the time cost. We could waste quite a bit of time playing a hand that is 0 EV if we play it perfectly, and we might of course mess up post-flop, so there ends up being a negative free roll element to this. But theoretically, if we play this hand perfectly, we're going to generate 0 EV. But we've spent time doing it. And what we could have done is folded, moved on, and used that time to play a hand which is actually going to be plus EV rather than 0 EV. Another thing to consider with the solved ranges is that if we were to play as wide as a solver, there's a lot of assumptions there regarding skill level. Some of these weaker hands are actually quite difficult to play post-flop. So the solver might say the EV is 0.1 big blinds, but when we play the hand, assuming we're going to make some mistakes post-flop, the EV might not actually turn out to be 0.1 big blinds. It might actually turn out to be negative. So just because the solver says you're supposed to defend super wide, doesn't mean it's the best choice for us in practice. Remember, the solver's making some inaccurate assumptions. It's assuming that we're a perfect GTO player. It's assuming our opponents are perfect GTO players. Now, the counter argument to this is that depending on our opponent, we might actually be able to play wider than the solver recommends in certain situations. So although we might not push as wide our big blind defending ranges by default against unknown opponents, if we know that our opponent is terrible, that's actually now a very good reason to defend wider than the solver would recommend. Because if the solver says a certain hand is break even against a perfect GTO opponent, well, surely that hand has to be plus EV against an opponent who doesn't really know how to play the game properly. So we can see, depending on the context, depending on our skill level, depending on the opponent we're facing, we have valid reasons for sometimes playing tighter than the solved ranges out of the big blind, but other times playing looser than the solved ranges out of the big blind. Keep in mind as well, just as a side point, that solves are run with a specific rake percentage and rake cap. So if a certain hand is a defend in a very low rake environment, that hand might not be a defend in a very high rake environment. Now let's continue to think about cold calling ranges, because there's one very important limitation to the majority of solved preflop ranges. And that is sizing. Open raise sizing when defending out of the big blind is absolutely crucial to generating the best or optimal response. And preflop solvers don't include different sizings. What's the reason for this? It's to do with memory requirements and the size of the game tree. If we were to have a solve where we gave the solver multiple different raise first in sizing options preflop, the game tree wouldn't be feasible. It would be too large. So we essentially have to pick a sizing and tell the solver to use that single sizing for its raise first in sizing. Now, one thing we can do is run the solve repeatedly and try different RFI sizings to see which generates the highest expectation. Then once we've found the sizing that generates the highest EV, we can run the solve using that sizing. But either way, the end result is still going to be a solve where we only have big blind defending ranges when facing a raise first in of one single sizing. So what we'll have to do is to make logical adjustments versus different sizings. Now you might think this is not really a big deal, but let me give you one example. So if we take a look at the red chip range for big blind cold call against a UTG open, so that's low jack UTG on a 6-handed table. Against a 2.5 big blind UTG open, the big blind is supposed to cold call around 18% of the time. But against a min raise from UTG, big blind is supposed to call 35% of the time. So the width of that cold calling range has doubled as a result of a 0.5 big blind change in open raise sizing. We can see dramatically different defending strategies based on the size of the open. So which range is used as part of the Red Chip Poker app? Well, if we have a look at the defending frequencies, we can see Red Chip has 17.5% cold call big blind versus UTG. So that would imply that it's based on an RFI sizing of 2.5 big blinds or larger. And if we were to take this range and use it against a min raise, we would technically be significantly under defending in that spot. Now, there's no reason why we couldn't also create a solve where the RFI sizing was always 2 big blinds. It would technically be part of a different solve, but then we could compare how we should defend against 2.5 and against 2 big blinds. Maybe we'll see that kind of thing in the future. But for now, we just want to understand that although we're given a static defending range, the actual optimal range we should defend is going to be related to the size of the open. And while 0.5 of a big blind might not seem like a lot, it can make a huge difference in terms of how wide we should be cold calling from the big blind. I think one of the obvious questions that players are going to ask as well is whether these red chip solved ranges will be okay for live games. And what is the key difference with most live games? Well, instead of facing a 3 big blind open, a lot of the time is going to be more like a 6 big blind open. It obviously depends on the venue, but this is fairly typical for live games. Now, if we think about that theoretically, in terms of pure game theory, we should obviously defend a lot tighter versus a 6 big blind open compared to how we defend against a 3 big blind open. But do we actually want to do that in a live game? Do we want to defend much tighter because the value of our big blind is much smaller relative to the size of the open? And the truth is we can likely defend a similar range to the ones that are used in the Red Chip Poker app, even when playing live. So although we're supposed to defend tighter against a large open from a game theory perspective, we can probably actually just use those defending ranges in practice for a live cash game. So how can we justify that? The simple reason is that live games are often a lot softer, our opponents are making more mistakes post-flop, and as we've already mentioned in this podcast episode, weak post-flop opponents is a justification for defending our ranges wider pre-flop. Just as a really general rule for thinking about how online games compare to live games, very often players buy in deep in the live game. They're playing 200 big blinds deep, and they open to 6 big blinds pre-flop. Whereas in an online game, players buy in for 100 big blinds and open to 3 big blinds pre-flop. So we can see live is almost double online. So a way of thinking about this is when you're playing a live game and you have 200 big blinds, well, imagine it's actually just a 100 big blind stack. And instead of opening for 6 big blinds, you're actually opening for 3 big blinds. In other words, 1 big blind in a live cash game is equivalent to 0.5 big blinds in an online game. So the types of ranges you can stack off with for 100 big blinds in an online game are going to be very similar to the types of ranges you can stack off with for 200 big blinds in a live game. So if we think about things that way, then the red chip solved ranges will be very good for your live games also. Alright, so make sure to check out the app and browse through some of the ranges. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.